evening from wherever you're watching this, and happy Earth Day. Thank you for joining Food Systems for the Future and EDF for this important Earth Day webinar. As you all probably know, food and agriculture are major drivers of climate change, in particular because of methane from livestock farming, nitrous oxide from the over-application of nitrogen fertilizer, and carbon losses from land conversion. To seriously address how our food system impacts the planet, we need to really change business as usual. But we need to do it in a way that improves livelihoods and rural economies and respects cultural and social values. This requires taking a really hard look at how to make protein sources more sustainable for a growing global population. One way to do this is challenging the idea that conventional meat and complementary proteins have to be and are mutually exclusive rivals. In fact, a diversity of consumer-accepted low and lower impact protein sources is really what we need to drive down methane and other environmental impacts from protein production. We have an opportunity to embrace a broader approach with a diversity of solutions if we don't go into that rivalry and we look at inclusive solutions that will not leave anybody behind. While we recognize that shifting diets is a major opportunity for greenhouse gas reductions, especially in higher income countries, we also want to ensure that lower methane meat and dairy options are offered for those consumers and populations who rely on animal-based proteins or simply prefer it. The urgency of the intersecting climate and human crises we're experiencing demands action that really looks at a toolkit that has all the options in it and that does not pit solutions against one another. This is why I'm really excited that Food Systems for the Future and EDF has been able to gather this group of experts to speak to you today on how to find common ground and solutions for a more sustainable protein future. On that note, I'd love to hand it over to my honorable colleague, Ambassador Earthren Cousin. Over to you, Earthren.
Thanks so much, Britt, and thanks for that really great and thoughtful opening that sets the stage for the conversation that we're having today, and conversations that are happening across the globe, not just on Earth Day, but in the recognition of the opportunity that faces us to reduce methane as a greenhouse gas, but also to ensure that we address the issues of food security and nutrition. And we have, as you noted, a panel of experts here, both practitioners in the field as well as experts working around the advocacy and the research issues involved related to this issue. So rather than spend our time going through the impressive bios of each member of our panel, we're placing the bios in the chat, which will give the audience an opportunity to read those bios. And I will simply introduce our panel with their titles, beginning with Annie Ryu, who is the CEO and founder of Jack and Annie's and the Jackfruit Company. Eric Mittenthal, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for the Meat Institute. Eve Thoreau-Paul, the founder and executive director of Food for Climate League. Lasse Braun, director of climate and food at the UN Foundation. And Shirley Terawali, the assistant director general of the International Livestock Research Institute, commonly known as ILRI, a CGIAR center. We have special remarks that are provided by Paul Newman, who's the CEO and SDG2 advocate of the CEO of the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. Paul could not join us today because he's in Australia and it's a different time zone than what we're in, but his remarks will be included in this recording. Let's begin with you, Annie. Where do you see opportunities for supplementary or complementary or alternative proteins, whatever you want to call them, and the traditional meat sectors, the animal protein sectors, to collaborate for shared impact. And what is the primary hurdle that you, as a leader in the complementary protein community, have found to that collaboration? And more importantly, how can we overcome the hurdles that you've identified?
Okay. We've done a really exciting new partnership working directly with the industry. So my company specializes in jackfruit, which is a naturally meaty plant. And what we've seen in the broader plant-based space is that consumers are really looking for a way to eat healthier and also to eat more sustainably. But not all of the consumer demand that went into the plant-based space was really satisfied by plant-based products. Consumers weren't always satisfied with the taste, weren't satisfied with the nutritionals, sometimes felt that some of the products were too processed. One of the innovations that we're working on directly with one of the largest distributors in the food service industry, Performance Food Group, is an item that is partly beef and partly jackfruit. And so it's really able to deliver the best of both worlds. It's delivering something that is better for your health. So it's a burger that has all the taste and texture of 100% beef, but it actually is 40% lower in saturated fat, cholesterol, calories, and carbon footprint. It's really delivering what consumers were looking for out of the plant-based space, but delivering also on some of the taste, nutritional benefits, simplicity that was to some consumers lacking when they tried some of the plant-based items that are out there. As far as what are some challenges, or also even what are some rising opportunities in this space, meat raw material prices are going up. And so part of what we're seeing, so we talk to meat manufacturers, is they're short of lower priced raw materials. And when you have a plant that is naturally meaty, you can actually start to address some of the raw material pricing concerns that even the meat industry is dealing with. So you can keep the cost of materials lower. We also see with jackfruit, our yields are much higher. So it's an opportunity also to improve yields on these items. As far as challenges to working with the industry, I think it's primarily about is there the open-mindedness to combine with a plant? It's not something that's been done that often in the past. Also, as far as jackfruit, it's something that has rocketed in awareness over the last decade, but it's still something that's relatively new. And I think the other piece is when you think about the plant-based industry, there's often been a hard line divide between, if you're vegan or if you're not vegan, and maybe not being even on the side of advocating for better for your health, better for the planet, not being as open to the idea of a partnership. And I think that as a company that Jack and Annie's the jackfruit company, we operate in the vegan space. Part of what we're trying to do to move things forward and provide solutions is to forge partnerships.
Terrific. In that same vein of new blended products and forging partnerships with the livestock community, let me go to Eric Mittenthal, who from a meat industry perspective, and to understand how your industry, your members are approaching this collaboration, whether it's with new blended products or simply other identified areas for alignment or collaboration that the industry has identified. But also, we know that if we continue to do the same thing with livestock production as we've performed in the past, we will continue to see the emissions. So there's lots of conversation about sustainable livestock management as part of this diversity of solutions. And is that an area that your members are prepared to embrace And if so, if so, what are the hurdles to action for sustainable livestock management, along with alignment with the plant-based or alternative protein community?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Earthrin. And the Meat Institute and the industry is really a big believer in consumer choice and in the wide variety of products available on the marketplace. It's not a one or the other; it's a both and we absolutely need a wide range of products that fulfill people's protein demands. In the U.S., 98% of American households purchase meat. And so we know that demand remains very high. That number has actually gone up over the last few years. And so the most important piece for us that we see within the industry is how do we work to implement practices on the ground that have the most impact, most positive impact for the planet. And how do we identify those and how do we get those implemented on farms and ranches? And so, in many cases, we know of the specific practices that work, things that are fairly simple, like grazing management plans for beef cows that are grazing. And we know that there are more advanced technologies that are out there related to feed additives, related to vaccines, genetics. And so it's really taking all of the tools in the toolkit and trying to implement them on the ground. For that, we know we need additional research, and the industry is actively investing in and identifying the research priorities that need to occur. We've been working closely over the last few months with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef to both identify the research needs that the industry has for implementing things on the ground, not just about what works, but actually how can it be implemented in ways that benefit producers? Because in the end, it's going to be necessary for producers to benefit from the practices that they're adopting, get credit for those practices. And so how do we make sure that they're getting credit for things that they are both already doing? And in many cases, they're doing so many positive things and should get credit for that. But then also adopting practices that I mentioned that we know work. And so we're going to be working together with the whole supply chain to invest and advance some of that research and then drive forward the accounting of how is that tracked throughout the supply chain and how are we able to make sure that the practices that are being implemented are benefiting producers on the ground, because they are certainly running businesses themselves and we want to make sure that they are getting credit for those things. We're also working very closely on the pork sector on genetics. We know that there are genetics in pork that reduce methane emissions from the pigs. And so we want to be able to capture that and apply those genetics and make sure that those are being tracked as well as they're being implemented across the industry. That will be able to be applied to beef as it moves forward as well. And we're trying to work, and we're very actively working with our members too, to collect data on all of these different things. And so as we have more data, we're able to produce materials, resources for both our members in the packer processor sector, as well as producers to demonstrate, here's the value in adopting these things. Here's how it benefits your company, how it benefits your farm and ranch, and here's the ways that you can go about adopting them. So it's really an all-in approach to make sure that all of those things are being put into play so that everybody in the industry is able to adopt them in ways that make sense for their businesses.
That's great to hear that there's a recognition that this is good for business, but also that consumer demands are changing, which brings us right to you, Eve. Consumer demand is often cited, you've heard it from both of our speakers ahead of you, as the challenge to scaling supplementary proteins, or even more so, to the investment in sustainable livestock management. Can we change consumer demand? And if so, how can we make climate smart eating, let's call it that, feel inclusive and aspirational? And what strategies help to connect the work to the values of eaters?
Earthrin, thank you for including me in this conversation. So for those who aren't familiar, Food for Climate League is a nonprofit that works mainly leveraging narrative and behavioral design to make climate smart food choices the norm. We are a yes and organization, and I think the answer to your question actually starts with talking about what is a yes and food system. In response to your question, I actually think there's two major cultural shifts that are needed, and the first one is internal. which is probably most of the people on this call, definitely the people on this panel, which is a recognition and acceptance that there are a multitude of ways of eating that will be better for the planet. And there are different solutions that are appropriate for different populations, depending on where you live, how much money you make, what your religion is, and what your personal preferences are, and also where you might be in your own behavior change journey. What habits are you learning to take on? What are these shifts going to be over time? And I think all too often we're actually working against each other by beating each other up, villainizing one another, saying there is one single solution to this problem. This world is so complicated. There is not one single solution to any of this. There are a multitude of ways of eating. So it's not plant-based versus regenerative beef, or vegan versus paleo, or alt meat versus whole plant. Reality is nuanced. And I think actually having that yes and narrative internally is step one, where we're making people feel like they have to choose a particular path. And the reality is our lives are just more nuanced than that. In terms of shifting food culture, and actually there's a question in the Q&A that's getting at this a little bit. My background is actually in doing research of the rise of foodie culture, and that's how I came to this. And my own realization about 5 years ago was that when most people talk about sustainable ways of eating, they're talking about tofu, they're talking about bland food that they think does not fill people up. And the reality is that today's biggest consumer demand trends are not at all in conflict with sustainable ways of eating. But we do have systems that don't recognize that are trying to push people towards more meat consumption, towards wasting more food. Our system is not encouraging people to make a more sustainable choice, but I actually would say that the problem is not on the consumer side. People are asking for more plant forward, more whole plant, healthier animal proteins. They want exotic colors, exotic textures. They want to be eating a greater diversity of plants as well. And I think that there's an opportunity here to really allow people to see themselves in this. All too often when we are talking about sustainable ways of eating, we're mainly framing it in the negative. It's about what are we asking people to take away from their meals? What are we asking them to give up for the common good? Well, we're living in a world with record high rates of depression and stress and anxiety and loneliness. Food is love, food is joy, it is comfort, and most people don't want to think about the apocalypse when they're eating, nor do they want to give up that moment of joy. And we don't have to ask people to give up those moments of joy. There's actually so many joyful, extremely delicious opportunities awaiting us. We need to shift that narrative, and we need to show people how these ways of eating are not foreign, it's not other, it's probably how your grandmother grew up eating. This is you, this is your culture, your heritage. It fits within your own desires, whether it's to build more muscle or to show off to your friends on Instagram. This can work for you and your priorities and your budget.
And we're going to come back to that budget question because I think it's quite critical that we talk about the issues around affordability. But I want to go to Lasse because a lot of issues have come up here in these first interventions, and the UN Foundation has performed work in this space to begin to answer some of these questions about how we as the community of actors who often disagree can bring together a narrative that addresses both the challenges and the opportunities that our speakers have identified here today. Why don't you give us a sense of the work that you've performed, the recommendations that you've identified, and the potential for how we as a community can move forward?
Great, thanks so much, Catherine, and happy to do that. And it's great to come straight after Eve because she covered a lot of stuff I was going to mention as well. I do want to say one thing though, which I find is important. Often when we talk about shifting to different diets, a lot of these conversations we are having are taking place in the global north, where we have certain ways of eating, like typical eat one meat, two veg, for instance. And I think sometimes we as a movement, and I call myself accountable for this as well, tend to forget how people eat in the rest of the world. And that's also linked to talking about global south versus global majority. Some years ago, there was a recognition we need to talk about the global majority because most people live in the global south and their diets there are not necessarily akin to what we're used to in the global north where we talk about meat. It's much less meat. It's focusing on teff, cassava, and other kinds of high protein products that have been taken, that are serving as the main nutrition sources for these people. So I think it's important we do that and to take that into the bigger perspective. And to your question, Eartharine, so what we've been doing at UN Foundation is trying to find a way to address the how and the what at the same time. I mean, we started by recognizing there's a wide diversity of animal agriculture production systems, and some of them are associated with significant health, environmental, social, and cultural benefits. But at the same time, animal agriculture in its current form is just unsustainable, accounting for, as you know, around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we tried to see how can we find a way to bring those who focus on the what and those on the how together. So simplifying it is like, though a lot of the stakeholders that are focusing on equity and equitable access to nutrition and shifting to focusing more on food sovereignty, on regenerative agriculture, and those who are keen to see a scaling up of alternative proteins, however that is defined, particularly in high-income countries, whether that is cultivated meat, plant-based meat, fermented meat, or just an increase in beans, pulses, and legumes, as Paul Noonan is the Beans is How man, who's going to be having a little intervention later on in the conversation. So we found that, you know, we in order to merge the how and the what, we really need to talk about a decrease on global animal protein consumption without getting into talking about the thinking about the apocalypse or eating, as Eve said, which I really like that picture, but rather saying like, so in order to have an equitable access to nutrition, because it's not just about protein, it's about macro and micronutrients and nutrition, particularly in low and middle income countries. There needs to be a global shift because the world cannot eat as we do in North America. I'm based in North America. We cannot do that, like more than 100 kilos per year, while in most African countries, the average consumption is 6 to 12 kilos per year. It is inequitable. And I think it's important that we look at that while we also talk about shifting to regenerative agriculture and looking into how we produce the food, because we want to shift to a way of producing food that is providing planetary and public health, at the same time making sure how we what we are producing adds to that equation as well. So in order to do that, we need to build a bridge between the how and the what, and really focusing on how things are carried out in different countries. So in high-income countries, there needs to be a lowering of animal protein consumption, shifting to alternatives that can provide the nutrients and also address the planetary health aspects. But at the same time, we need to safeguard nutrition security in least developed countries. And doing that is not easy because traditionally, when global North countries let's talk about food systems and changing diets, most global South countries, or global majority countries, rightfully so, say, well, we're not ready to have that conversation. We're dealing with hunger, stunting, nutrition insecurity. We need to address that first. But we cannot keep throwing mud at each other. So if you look at it from in a multilateral perspective, we need to enable a dialogue between countries, where those countries in the global North that are taking a stance on lowering their consumption of animal protein to meet planetary boundary issues and public health are actually praised for that and are put in a position where they are seen as somebody who are leaders and not trying to impose a neocolonial approach to global South countries. So it is very difficult, and we're working on trying to find the best balance and finding ways of enabling dialogue between countries. I just want to end on one thing, to say it's interesting when you talk about nutrition specifically and you talk about child nutrition. Even UNICEF is really looking into this now. Last month, they published a report called Child Nutrition and the Climate Crisis, which is kind of like a framework for action. And they really, there's a recognition in that report that to safeguard these very vulnerable children, we must ensure that the food they eat is healthy for the planet, while also providing all the nutrition and micronutrients they need. In other words, don't let the diets they're shifting to feed their bodies undermine the soil and health systems they need to thrive on for the future.
Mm-hmm. Great. I love the how and the what, and not just focusing on one aspect of this, and the recognition of the challenges, not just of narrative, but of life and lifestyles, is as well as livelihoods in the global South, or as you say, the global majority, that need to be taken into account, which brings us right to you, Shirley, and the work that that's you and Ilri have performed in this space. And so speaking to that question of how can livestock systems in the global South, the global majority countries, contribute to the methane reduction, where many will argue that they should not have a responsibility for contributing to methane reduction, but others will suggest that this is an opportunity for us to leapfrog the challenges of the global North, that and the diets that have been the historical diets in the global North and the historical agricultural practices in the global North, when the global, that we should find ways to achieve the methane reduction in the global South while respecting, acknowledging, and understanding the need for food security and resilient livelihoods, as well as culturally relevant diets. A big issue for me to put in front of you, but this cannot be a conversation that excludes the issues related to the global North. It is not just about creating a template and then applying it over the global South. It is about recognizing the differences in both the issues at hand as well as the solutions that need to be developed. Tell us more, Shirley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, which is, I think, an involving conversation, maybe a dialogue, as Lassie mentioned, and I've been part of several before, and see an increasing, I hope, coming together of people and organizations who had very diverse views. As I think it was Eve said, it's no longer either or, it's both and we really all need to be in this to find solutions. And the solutions you've just touched on, it's that triple win that we have to, all of us, wherever we're coming from, simultaneously address the need for nutritious, healthy foods for many who are presently undernourished, but also for those who have lots of choice, those consumers that were mentioned. Making sure that livestock continue to contribute to multiple development outcomes, as they do at the moment. 1 in 6 people rely on livestock for some kind of livelihood at the moment, 1 in 6 on the planet. And to mitigate possible harms if we go in a wrong way, whether it's environment or health or whatever it might be. And one of the keys for that, other speakers have also touched on, is harnessing the diversity. Context matters. What system, what commodity, what political and economic context are we looking at? So that we can look for positive trajectories from whatever those starting points might be towards, and I think we're all on the same end goal here, healthy, sustainable food systems. But those trajectories are going to look different depending on where we start from. So different, perhaps in some cases, we might not think we're even talking about the same thing. So I think that's been some of the polarization we've seen, and I see a much greater appreciation and coming together, which is exactly what we need. If you'll excuse my pun, I've coined a phrase, sustainable livestock currency. That's a coin with 2 sides. On one, adaptation, on the other, mitigation. And for livestock, especially livestock in low and middle income countries, that's special because actions on either side always have co-benefits on the other side. If you reduce methane emissions through various ways, you will also benefit resilience, etc. And when we talk about low and middle income countries, it's really important to recognize that most animal products, the protein, but also the other essential nutrients, multiple livelihood outcomes, are coming from smallholder systems. It's a few animals, but raised in a very integrated way In fact, most of the crops can only be produced because livestock are part of those integrated systems: manure, traction, eating the crop leftovers. So lots of benefits in that kind of system, and we don't want to lose those good things. But the challenge is those systems are not producing enough to meet the demand, even for small amounts of nutritious livestock products, the UNICEF goals that Lasse just mentioned. So that low productivity needs to be addressed. And that's where our big opportunity is, because most of the approaches to address improving productivity, which maybe we get a chance to talk about later, mean the environmental footprint per liter of milk or per unit of meat, whatever, that will come down. So there's great opportunities to address these challenges through combining technologies that improve animal production, placing that in a wider political economy to give that triple win. Several colleagues, if you'll allow me, have mentioned this diet part. But I think there's many layers here. If we start from the basics, folks, we all agree about the nutrients we need for healthy bodies, brains, physical development, you name it. The nutrients get packaged into foods. We've all talked about different foods. I've talked about meat and milk. Others have talked about jackfruits and alternative proteins. We heard about all types of meat from Eric. When the food gets sorted into diets, we sometimes get into controversy, and we touched on consumers. I think that's related to choice. Many consumers have lots of choice. You can choose to be vegan or vegetarian. You can get a supplement if you need. But many millions of people are not able to make those kinds of choices. And those are the ones that we're focusing on with our work, trying to make sure that the nutrients from animal foods, but also from a whole mix of other foods that may be in the system, the environment where they live, whether they're beans or cereals or jackfruit, perhaps, I think in many places is a good one. How do we bring those together, starting from that to really get that nutritious diet and address all these multiple other dimensions as well? And that's where we get into food system. Thank you, Catherine.
Shirley, let me just say that your comments stimulate so many different issues, and I think let's take that one issue that you've identified and give it to all of the panelists to come back with about a minute or two of response, and that is because here in this conversation we haven't disagreed that we need a diversity of solutions. There hasn't been anyone who argued one or the other. Everyone is talking about, each of you have made presentations about the opportunity for a diversity of solutions. If that's the case, then how do we increase productivity, as well as address the issue of affordability of all of whether it is supplemental proteins or the alternative proteins, as well as sustainably managed livestock, so that these solutions that we are discussing are not just the solutions of the affluent, particularly in a time when we have 3.1 billion people who can't afford a diverse and nutritious diet. As opposed to simply talking about diet diversity, we must also talk about how the solutions address the issue of affordability. Annie, let's start with you.
Absolutely. First, when we think about it as a company, it's scale. And so we are primarily shipping frozen food. And even for the items that we ship that are, ambient, don't need to be temperature controlled in shipping, we are dealing with lack of economies of scale. So I would say the more people that we can get choosing our items, jackfruit, items that are made from jackfruit, and the whole plant-based meat space has such a tiny fraction of the volume of the meat industry, less than 1%. And so you can look at some of the raw materials and it's like, well, that raw material actually isn't more expensive than meat. So why is this finished product more expensive than meat? And it's an issue of lack of economies of scale at every single step of the supply chain and every single part of the cost of any good that is getting to the end consumer. That said, economies of scale and scale in general, don't come overnight. So one of the ways to address that problem quickly is again through partnerships. And if we can leverage the fact that, we are expert in jackfruit supply, and we operate the leading global supply chain for jackfruit and partner with somebody in the meat industry and together, get economies of scale at each of the different parts of the cost structure. And we can deliver something that is, directly competitive in ways that, with our scale alone, we wouldn't be able to get to the consumer.
That's terrific. Let's go over to you, Eric, because many, particularly in the livestock community, have said they can't afford that sustainably produced food will cost more. Are we, by addressing the solutions regarding sustainability, are we making potentially making animal proteins even more unaffordable for consumers with limited budgets?
Well, I think, focusing on productivity is really key. The UN in their livestock sustainability report in 2023 said that sustainable productivity growth is the #1 thing that we can do globally to improve sustainability of livestock and reduce our impact on the planet. And so, that it really is the most important lever. And, really happy that Shirley brought that up. It's productivity and affordability are completely linked. And the US industry in particular is excellent at making sure that we are maximizing the use of every single animal that we are raising and getting all of the meat and all of the byproducts off that animal so that they are being used in various formats. And so, as we're bringing all of that meat to the marketplace, that improves its affordability. Whereas if you were not utilizing all of that, you have less product, you have higher prices. And so we need to make sure that we are continuing to do that and maximizing everything that the animal gives us, both in meat and in the other products as well.
Terrific. And maximizing productivity in sustainable production, I think, as you've described it, is a way forward that, again, Eve, back over to you, because what the farmers say is, I produce in a manner that consumers will purchase.
Yeah.
And consumers are saying the data has suggested that they will not pay more for sustainably produced food. So if the issue is productivity, is that the issue alone?
No, it's not. And I am going to say some things that probably will be more controversial, Earthrin, that maybe some other folks on this call won't agree with. First of all, we have a system that encourages people to frequently eat cheap animal protein and highly processed food. Now, just because I often have people say this to me, they're like, well, but we're selling like hotcakes. Well, okay, if the system is designed to encourage people to do this, then that's what they're going to do. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they want to do. And I've spent a lot of time looking into, if all of these barriers were removed, really, what do you want? And long story short, no matter what your political background, no matter what the geography is, mainly people want the same thing. They want to be feeding themselves and their kids healthy and nutritious foods, and they want to do so in a way that is not harming the planet, because this is what we're relying on for future generations. The problem comes in when they're starting to have finger pointing of saying, well, your people are the problem, your way of doing this is the problem. I do think that I personally see a future in which animal proteins are less affordable. I personally think that we need to be eating far less animal protein, particularly in the global north. And my expertise is in the global north, not in the global south, right? But all of these things have drastic impacts on the globe. We cannot maintain a system where it is the norm to be eating a burger or a hot dog every single day. We need to be providing, as Eric was saying, we need to be giving credit and money to the farmers who are raising cattle and pork and whatever else it might be in a sustainable manner, we should be paying more for those products. And there needs to be a diverse system to provide whole proteins for those who aren't eating a steak every single day. I see a world in which there is alternative meats, cellular agriculture, whole plants, fungi. Right now, if you say, you know, alternative proteins or plant-based or whatever it is, people say, well, how am I going to afford that? They just think of the Impossible Burger. Well, rice and beans is a really great solution. So are peanut butter sandwiches. There's so many different ways to eat that are fulfilling. It's the way that my family eats. I don't feel like I'm depriving my children of anything. We really need to be making, though, these foods more healthy and more accessible and more desirable. And something that I have found in our research at Food for Climate League is that even when you have a solution like beans, for example, a nutritious plant protein that is really essential also for crop rotations and healthy crop rotations, low-income eaters in the United States say, beans are for poor people. They're not for me. I don't want them. And the only way that we've been able to find to get people excited about this is to reframe the way we talk about beans. It's actually about nostalgia. It's about inclusivity. It's about diversity. Travel the world through beans. And suddenly you get people really excited because they want to be wrapped in a warm hug. And it's really about how do we allow people to see themselves in these other ways of eating, rather than just saying, well, you know what? I think that a bag of Doritos and a burger is me. How do we open people's eyes to say, no, this may be you right now, but how did your grandmother eat? The generations before you, where your family came from, how are they eating? And how do we allow people, again, to participate in a more diverse way of eating, again, while still celebrating farmers, but a greater diversity of farmers, greater diversity of crops. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'll leave it there.
That's a great way to end it, though, is talk, how do we talk about this with a greater diversity of crops and greater diversity of solutions? I'm going to, because we're short on time, this has been such a robust and interesting dialogue, go to a couple of the questions that we received ahead of time in preparation for today's seminar. And I'm going to ask a favor of the panelists. To those questions that have been placed into the Q&A, where there are questions that are directly related to you and your work, please feel free to respond to them in writing as we are continuing the dialogue. The next question, though, I'm going to give to you, Lasse, because it's one that asks the question of what are the most effective and equitable and scalable government policies right now to cut livestock emissions? Are there any?
Well, right now, it depends on where you look, and it depends on which countries you are addressing this. I mean, if you look at North America, there's this discrepancy between national dietary guidelines and actually where the money flows. So in a country like Canada, they actually have excellent national dietary guidelines that really focuses on less and better when it comes to meat, much more beans, pulses, legumes, fruit, and veg, more generally speaking. But the production system, and as Eve was speaking, the way people are introduced to ways of eating are what is normalized through advertisement or lifestyle choices that are popularized, is a system that relies a lot on meat, and the more like the cheap meat, so to speak. And so there needs to be a better alignment between national dietary guidelines and the funding that goes into the food systems. And right now, that is definitely not aligned. There are some countries that are looking into ways of really addressing that. And I'm going to mention Denmark, not just because I'm from Denmark originally, but because Denmark actually has developed a series of steps to really take this seriously. First starting with some years ago where they introduced a climate legislation, not just policy legislation. They're actually legally obliged to cut their emission drastically over the next 10 years. That was followed by a way of making all these different stakeholders work together around an approach to limiting emissions from agriculture, limiting water overconsumption, overflow into water systems, biodiversity loss, and so forth, and rewild a lot of Denmark. And they did that through a very difficult dialogues between farmers, farmer constituencies, consumer groups, the government, consumers themselves, and came up with a way of that in a plan that everybody could agree on. Essentially, is to rewild a big part of Denmark, double the amount of forest. And to do that, there needed to be a decrease in animal protein production and consumption, particularly around pork and also to some extent dairy. And the way they did that was to really look at the co-benefits and be serious about what does it mean for farmers. And to the questions about just transition, how do we address farmers that are suffering from lack of access to funds if they transition overnight? How do we deal with stranded assets for big livestock farmers? How do we deal with compensation plans, retraining? The classic examples, well, you produce chicken, let's produce fungi or mushrooms instead, but how do you do that practically? And all of that was taken into consideration until everybody had a good way forward. And not even that was enough. They actually went further and developed a new ministry, the tripartite ministry, that has the sole purpose of really implementing this new policy and building on strong collaboration between ministries of agriculture, ministries of climate, and ministries of finance and foreign affairs, even because there's a big trade issue in terms of feed for animal livestock production as part of this as well. So they did that. And then on top of that came the protein or shifting to more plant protein framework that actually addressed all the aspects: policy change, investments in new ways of producing food, but also investments in teaching people, consumers, the best ways of eating. So not just saying, well, we have a new dietary guidelines published this year, there you go on this website and check it. How many people do that? Hardly anybody. So they actually went further and looked into how do we go into the public space through education, through advertising, public service information, and educate people to do the right thing. So there's a link between supply and demand and the funding that goes into that. So I would say that's one of the key examples right now. And I know it's been such a big success that the EU is looking to see how can the Danish model, so to speak, potentially be rolled out across different countries. But I want to be clear, this is a very global north example. For least developed countries, we find ourselves in a very different situation where we first and foremost need to focus on nutritional needs.
So Shirley, that takes me right back to you again. What I'd like to do is bring us into in addressing this question that we received to the UN Food System Summit, which will be held this summer in Addis. As we think about what is necessary, the how and the what of moving forward in a more unified way between the communities of actors to ensure that we have this full basket of solutions that support our environmental sustainability as well as human health and nutrition, as well as the incomes that are necessary for farmers. What are the outcomes from the UN Food System Summit that we should all drive towards that would particularly bring the global South into this conversation in a way that would be beneficial to the majority, as you point out, of those who live on this planet?
Thanks. That's right. This is a fascinating discussion. I think an outcome is exactly the direction we're heading in, and that is recognizing that, as we said before, it's not either or, it's both and, that we really need all the solutions. We need them in different ways, in different mixes, in different contexts. What I know, for example, is that in many of the environments where we work, bringing together solutions that feed animals better, make sure you have the right genetics, look after animal health, those can already give you probably up to 30% reductions in greenhouse gases. But at the same time, you're getting more food as well. Imagine if we combine those with some of the newer technologies that others on the call have mentioned, and I'm sure many in the participants also know, and start to weave those in as well, so that we don't, you mentioned leapfrog, we don't just go at the same pace. We need to go really quickly, and we need action. So for me, one of the outcomes from that conversation would be that recognition of context, of nuance, diversity, but the need for all of us to bring this whole bundles of solutions together in very different contexts Lasse, you were just talking about Denmark and their food-based dietary guidelines. I was in a conversation recently at the Nutrition for Growth conference where a colleague from Ethiopia described what they're doing in that space. And it was really great to hear how they're really starting from what people have on the ground now. But then in most cases across lower middle income countries, that needs to be improved. Maybe it can be improved by bringing new technologies, new ways of processing beans or whatever may be there, new ways of more efficiently and sustainably producing the animal products that are already part of the system, but at very low levels often of productivity. We need all those things, and we need to recognize these multiple pathways to a solution to an end game that we all agree with. I just wanted to mention that we at ILRI, we've launched what we call a livestock and climate solutions hub. And that really is an effort to bring together not just our work, the technologies, as well as measuring greenhouse gases, but to convene many others in that space and touching in the policy space that we need to work together to bring solutions to scale. So I think really what we're talking about are pathways towards a healthy plateful. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we go to the Paul Newman video, let me ask each one of you if you could leave one sentence message to this audience and how we continue to move this conversation forward to increase the amount of capital that is invested in the sustainable transformation of the food system to support the types of issues that you have identified as necessary for us to achieve the access to the not just protein, but as Lasse pointed out, the micronutrients that are necessary, as well as addressing the environmental issues that are related to the livestock production as we know it today and future of leapfrogging in the global south, taking all those issues into account and helping us overcome the challenge of more financing in this space to support all of this work. What would be that one sentence that you would leave with this audience that would move us forward? Again, Annie, we're going to start with you.
That is a tricky one. I would say part of what we see in the plant-based space is just a need to increase the return on capital, and that will of course attract more capital. There were too many different players that came into the space with exactly the same solution, and not enough partnerships to really leverage each different player's advantages to get the best returns. So I think there's a great opportunity now to create the right partnerships to get higher returns, which will attract more capital to the space.
Terrific. Then over to you, Eric. You have that one sentence.
Meat is uniquely nutrient dense. It's not easily replaced by other products, and so the consumer demand is very much in support and seeking meat. And so we need to look for solutions to make sure that we are producing it as sustainably as possible and investing in that so that farmers and ranchers are getting benefit from it. And that's the pathway forward for the meat industry.
And then Eve.
I'd say consumer demand is not encapsulated in what the markets are showing today, and that there is a lot of openness and possibility for behavior change. You cannot make assumptions of what people want. And when you reframe the narrative and show people, allow people to make a better choice and make it the easy choice, behavior change is legitimately possible and incredibly powerful.
Terrific. Then over to you, Lasse.
Yeah, I think equitable distribution of resources is key here. And on Earth Day, we should be moving away from a system that tries to fight nature to one that works with nature. So in the global north, we normally talk about meat saying less is better, but that doesn't really apply to low and middle income countries. So maybe we could extend that sentence and coin it in a new way that says less, better, and globally balanced.
And then finally, Shirley, you, please.
It's hard to better what Lasse just said, but I think we need to work in new partnerships, new ways to bring new solutions that really harness diversity towards that healthier plateful.
Terrific. We have a video from Paul Newman.
My name is Paul Newnham. I am the CEO at the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. The sustainability of our planet is not just a trend. It is an absolutely essential challenge that we need to all come together around. Food plays such a huge role, and it's something that we all have lots of personal understandings around, and also information and backgrounds and lots of preferences. We know there is no one fixed solution to our climate and health problems, but we need complementary actions and approaches. And so rethinking protein sources to ensure diversified protein options is a really critical thing for us to do to make progress. Think about what are the options that are out there for reducing not only the quantity you're eating, but also looking at the diversification across many different types of food groups. And this means bringing in things like beans, peas, and lentils. It means eating and thinking with a more holistic view of diet that is more than just protein, but also thinking about fiber intake, thinking about other micronutrients that you need, and energy intakes. And I think if we start to do this, we can instantly increase the sustainability and the impacts of of each of our, I guess, footprints or food prints on the world. And so I think for me, the one message I would give is just to really pivot around this challenge, this question, look at not only the quantity of protein that you need, but also look at the diversification of the types of protein you're eating. One of the ways we do a lot of work around this is to bring in chefs and the voices of chefs as advocates from different cultures, from different heritages, to talk about constructing meals which are more balanced, that really feature some of the ingredients which we know scientifically are better for people and planet.
With that, Britt, I'm going to turn it back over to you to bring us home, because we've learned a lot today. I think we've made some progress in the conversation because you've heard from a diverse set of experts about not only the work that is happening, but the challenges that we face, as well as the solutions that we may, as a community, consider as we move forward.
Yes, Earthrin, thank you. What an amazing panel, and thank you all for your great contributions. Also, thank you to the listeners for the great questions that both come in beforehand and during this. Too many to get to, so we will try to do that. I was struck by the agreement around the solution diversity that we all acknowledge. It's not either or. Because of the complexity of the system, there is nutritional security issues, there's regional diversity issues, budget and affordability issues, and food system issues, as Eve alluded to. We do not need to assume that the status quo is where we need to stay and the only option that consumers will tolerate. I want to also acknowledge the issue, at least in the livestock sector, but I think it's also true in what we, Earthrin and I, tend to call complementary protein instead of alternative protein, because we see these things as being necessary together, is this issue of improved productivity. Productivity improvements, especially in the global south, are a potential win for the farmers, for nutrition, and for the environment. So it's something we really need to focus on, and it can include relatively simple issues such as animal health and improved animal feed. The diversity of the issues that we are looking at, most of them touch upon financing. Annie, point is well taken. I also saw a question about fair transition for farmers. Obviously, Eric touched upon the need to ensure that farmers are rewarded for the changes that they do try to make. And so I think this issue of affordability for consumers versus ensuring that farmers are well rewarded is where we need to like focus a lot of our thinking, and we should do it in a way that doesn't, you know, pitch this sort of alternative proteins or complementary proteins against the meat. And I'm also very intrigued by Annie's blended protein solution, the burger that has a little bit of everything, but might therefore be more affordable. I want to thank everybody for this discussion. Earthrin and I and our teams have been working on this issue of how do we try and bring people together and avoid the sort of silos and people working in different camps and therefore working against each other, and things are getting resolved for a little while. And every time we have one of these sessions, I think we're getting a little step further to continue to work together. So I want to thank everybody who joined the session, especially our amazing speakers, but also all of you who watch this at home or at work. Thank you so much. Earthrin, do you want to close and say goodbye?
I just want to say this is the beginning. This is a journey that we're on. It's not the beginning, but it's definitely a journey. And if we want to bring the world with us, we must have these types of conversations that ensure that we are not, those of us working in the space are not disagreeing in such a way that there is no space for growing this movement to achieve the goals of a sustainable food system that provides for environmental and human health. Thank you all for participating.